So why don't we get started with some intros now that it's 10 after? I think we had a nice little break. And we're giving some people some time to join. Thank you, everybody. So for those of you who it's your first time joining our Salesforce Saturday, Road to CTA and Beyond, started Salesforce Saturday for anyone interested in the Salesforce platform and connecting with Salesforce, learning more about architecture, learning more about Salesforce, prepping for your pyramid, as well as prepping for your Salesforce boards and just getting more information about Salesforce. I'm one of your co-leaders, Megan, and then we also have Paul and Daniel. Hi, I'm Megan. Megan SF on Twitter. Been in the ecosystem 14 years. Going on 15. And if you name it with Salesforce, I probably do it. I'm a technical architect and practice manager over at Cicd Consulting. And I've been there for about 2.5 years. Also a user group leader, podcaster, and I'm working on preparing for my CTA. And I drank that Kool-Aid, and then I didn't just keep drinking of the Kool-Aid. I just jumped straight into the deep end with it. Never got out of the pool. Paul, you want to go give a high-level intro yourself?
Sure. Hey, I'm Paul McCollum, an enterprise architect for about the past 20 years. I've been a developer for the past 40. Done a lot of work in retail. Started out as a WAN architect in Nortel in the early thousands. So started drinking the Kool-Aid. Was it 2017? I entered and won a development competition for Salesforce and kind of started porting all my interest over to the platform and the ecosystem and how well it was growing and how fun it was to work in. So that's me.
Daniel.
Hello, everyone. Daniel Gorton. I'm a Salesforce solution architect in the nonprofit space. I've been loving this platform and community for over 5 years. I learn so much every day, and I love doing what I can to support the community through this group. I also co-lead with Jade and Antonella, the Boston Salesforce Saturday group, which is coming up next weekend. And yeah, just welcome and thank you all for being here.
Excellent. And then to start introducing our special guests, we have a couple of people here to talk about security. We'll start with Shannon and Ryan and then move on to our guest of honor, Waqas. So Shannon, why don't you start?
I'm Shannon Smith, COO at Digitsec. Like Paul, I come from way back in the day, grabbing a keyboard as soon as I could write, basically, and love computers, the whole stack, layers 1 through 7. I've done it all a little bit, but yeah, one of the areas I found most interesting is security. I've been working professionally in cybersecurity for the last 20 years. And yeah, I started using Salesforce around 2005 and doing some power using, I guess, early on, just because I never had an administrator available to me. But certainly am an amateur compared to any of the folks on this call. Nowhere near an architect. I can architect in my mind, but that's about it. But yeah, our company is providing a full spectrum application security solution that's purpose built for Salesforce. Nothing like anybody's ever seen before. And we're real happy to be here. Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, and I'm Ryan. I'm actually Shannon's younger brother. I work with Waqas and Shannon at Digitsec, and I always love joining these because I love hearing the questions people ask about Salesforce security. And every time Waqas speaks about things, I always end up learning something myself. So happy to be here. Thanks, Megan and Paul and everyone for setting this up and doing this on Saturday. Appreciate it.
And then Waqas, our guest of honor, security expert. Go for it, man.
Thank you, Megan. My name is Waqas Nazir. I am the founder and CEO of Digitsec. We are a security testing platform for developer security for Salesforce. My background is primarily in application security starting off, and I pivoted to Salesforce once I was doing a lot of assessments for ISVs, and also a lot of pen tests for Salesforce customers, which excited me to this platform in the sense that there was a lot of moving pieces and security was being implemented in many different places within the platform. So looking at it holistically was very interesting to me. So I ended up, creating the product to address that particular need. So I'm happy to be here and talking to you about a field that I'm quite passionate about, and thank you for having me. And I hope it's a useful session for you all, so you can understand the security of the platform better, but also look at security from maybe a attacker's perspective, which I believe is very valuable when you're trying to secure any system.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, so let's just jump straight on in. So Waqas, you mentioned taking a look at security from the hacker's perspective, and I definitely want to get to that. But I also want to start with, what are some of the general things with security that are out there about Salesforce that are some of those best practices that people should be paying attention to and should be following with their build? Some of those foundational items that people should be keeping in mind, especially when solutioning and when testing. So on the solutioning side, what are some of those items with security that we should be keeping in mind?
So that's a very good question. So designing on Salesforce, I think, requires a bit of concentrated effort if you want to design it securely from the ground up. And it starts with the base of how the data will be accessed. So I think the key foundation for Salesforce as a platform is identity and access control, right? And I think that is the core of where the design should happen from a security perspective. So really understanding the problem that you're trying to solve, or the business function that you're enabling, and understanding all the different types of users you'll have, all the different personas and use cases, and coupling that with the type of data that you'll be dealing with, so you can design your identity as well as your access controls properly, is, I think, the sort of the baseline for designing a secure implementation of Salesforce. And from experience, that is an area which is often sort of the last or sort of the thing that kind of involves as people start using Salesforce. So as an architect or somebody who's implementing a solution, and having that foresight that how this will grow, how the platform will grow, how identities will change, how new users' cases will be supported, and how you can make sure that the data doesn't get exposed, is all elements of this base that you want to create for Salesforce. So I think the number one thing is creating the right data model and access control, and understanding all the different pieces that go with that in Salesforce is critical. One of the principles that I recommend from a security perspective when doing that is the principle of least privilege. And that's implemented in Salesforce, sort of that pyramid way, right? So you start with the most restrictive data access policy, which is the least data policy required for somebody to perform their action. And then you open up based on requirements to enable more access. But when you start enabling more access, that is also an area where there's a lot of pitfalls and things like that you have to be aware of. So there, things like those are more implementation specific, but you should be aware of those as an architect, because if for every single thing that a person has to do, you have to create a new permission set or keep extending profiles or sharing rules, then at a point that may become something that is not manageable and things like that. So understanding all those aspects and creating a data model that can scale and be secure is critical from a design perspective. So I think that's one thing. I mean, from the basics, I would say that's the most important in Salesforce.
Nice. And I think we all know what some of those side effects are that happen when you go for too much access. People end up being able to touch stuff they're not supposed to touch. People end up somehow getting into setup and moving stuff around when they're not supposed to, and they should fix it themselves. Or they just end up doing things that aren't their job, and next thing you know, you've got stuff that they weren't trained on happening. Or you open up your org to entirely new issues that don't even relate to the people inside your org. Where do you see some of those most common security issues in Salesforce happening, and what are some of them?
Sure. So I think one thing that, based on what I was just sharing, a lot of things, like you said, that we observe are around data access, right? But also where we see there's a lot of attack vector, and there's an area that is often overlooked is customizations on top of the platform, right? So even if you have a great data model, you have great provisioning, permissioning, and all that in place. When you start customizing Salesforce by writing custom code or installing third-party components and extending Salesforce beyond its core box by connecting apps and enabling remote sites and all those different features, each of those have a security implication. And those are where there's not a lot of controls in place to assess these changes before they're put in production. And we see, like, when you start adding custom code or adding custom things to Salesforce, if you don't address the security of that, you're basically opening yourself up to attacks. And these attacks are basically any attack that you would have to a common web application, because in the end of the day, Salesforce is a web-based SaaS platform. So things like sockle injection, things like authorization bypass, things like cross-site scripting, things like cross-site request forgery, all well-known web exploits. And then things specific to Salesforce, things like having sensitive information in your debug logs, or having sensitive information in your view state, stuff like that, which is specific to the Salesforce platform. All those attack vectors, if they're not addressed, they're basically there for somebody to exploit. So that's an area that we see is, like, as Salesforce grows and has all these tentacles going out, enabling all these features, we see that those attack vectors are then things that lead to potential data breaches and people hacking and changing stuff that they shouldn't be able to change. We've seen, for example, Salesforce is driving sales, right? And there's orders and there's pricing and codes. So we've seen like exploits affecting like hundreds of millions of dollars worth of orders. So it's not something trivial, but sometimes people think that since we've got our permissions locked down, since we've got good admins, we have a good workflow around identity and access management, we've got it squared. But Salesforce's custom code runs with system context. So those things can basically trump all the effort put in by a good architect or admin to maintain good data security. So from the common things that we see or which are overlooked, that's one key area. And Salesforce keeps coming up with new features like Salesforce flows and things like that, which enable more data access. And then they have the ability to circumvent the data model, right? For example, what's very interesting with flows is, just to give you an example, is that you can, one is the obvious thing, that you can mark the flow as to run with system context, which is basically the same as giving somebody like modify access, all data, like the MAD permission. So that flow basically runs with MAD permission. But what's also interesting is that Salesforce flows can be chained, right? You can chain different flows together. So if a user has access to trigger the first flow, and if the second flow runs with system permissions, and the user should not be able to run that flow, they can trigger that flow by triggering a flow that was, that the initial flow that they have access to, which is very interesting, right? So security doesn't flow in the flow, if you understand what I'm saying. So the context doesn't flow. So those are some of the things that we see that often are overlooked and can cause serious vulnerabilities and harm to a Salesforce work.
So if you'll let me, I've got a question. So big subscriber to least privilege. I have trouble moving from project to project or going in and out of orgs and not being able to understand their roles, their permission security structure. Have you seen any, I don't know if there's tools, I hope I'm not just setting this up as a softball question, but for understanding and visualizing security model. When I work on projects, so like, yeah, grant this person access or this profile, or use this, grant this profile, this permission set. And I'm always stuck, well, how do we know they don't already have permission through some other means? With all the overlapping ways to get access to objects. There's a role hierarchy, you can set that up, and that's very visible and very seeable, but all of the permission sets seems to be kind of one-off to each permissible, I don't know if that term has been coined yet, but how do we visualize and understand org security?
That's a very good question. So part of the problem, I think, is, like you said, there are so many layers to where somebody has access, right? And it's hard to decipher those. We, as a product, have this feature where you can actually look at like cumulative permissions by objects. So from an attacker's perspective, right? So if you have users who have excessive permissions that they shouldn't have, those are the things that we can flag. But I think visualizing the current security model is, I think, a challenge. And it is something, I think, that could be automated, right? And that will be a lot of value. But to your point, there isn't an easy way out of the platform to kind of understand holistically, like, if I choose this user and this object and these fields, tell me like how this user has access to this, right? So a path can be visualized easily. So I think that's an interesting scenario to solve from just a project management perspective, right? So I would say there's a way of doing that programmatically, right? And we have those tooling because we do look at like cumulative access, right? And you could technically extend that for everything. we're looking at from an attacker's perspective, right? Why do you have, somebody with, view all data access while, they are lowest part in your hierarchy and things like that. So those things we can look at, but I think to your question, there is an opportunity to perhaps visualize it for across the board so that it's easier to understand those things.
Thanks. Have you seen anybody come up with interesting patterns on managing and maintaining their org security that helps them prevent attacks, or helps them manage and maintain knowledge of their org security that keeps them kind of out of the crosshairs? Or
Yeah, I mean, not to sound like a product pitch here, but our product actually helps with that, right? So we look at Salesforce holistically. So we look at all the custom code that's deployed within the Salesforce org. And I think that's the best practice, regardless of how you want to go about it, right? That you look at all the moving pieces within the Salesforce. So one is your your identity management and access provisioning, right? That's number one. Second is your custom code and customizations, right? Third is if you rely on any third-party components and you rely on open source software or what have you, that's part of your org, how are you keeping that up to date? And then the fourth critical element is basically looking at the environment, like how it's configured. So basic configuration settings. If you are able to look at these key elements, then I think you'll have a pretty good chance of keeping your org secure. The other thing is you may do this exercise once, right? You go through this exercise and you are able to get to a level of assurance that, yeah, we're doing the right things. But tomorrow a change can happen, right? There's constant change happening. There is admins changing things, there are developers deploying code. So to maintain that, you need to have some tooling around it and some process around it to make sure the tools do get run, and then the issues that the tools identify or flag are able to be triaged and addressed, right? So it's not just a checkbox, right? There's actually security coming out of it. So those, I think, are the key elements of making sure that your orgs are secure. Salesforce does provide basic configuration checks with health check, right? That's always a good practice to do. But that, again, is like a point in time check, right? It's not something like, you can do like every single day, go click on that and see what has changed. So you need some automation to address that, but there are some tools that can help you, at least on the config side, to do that.
And what recommendations do you have around documentation? This has come up in a couple of other meetings where, and Paul, you were talking about coming into orgs, and just any general tips on ways to lay that out in a document so that someone coming in to the org next time, or just even for your own, or if you're working with the team, everyone's on the same page about the security landscape from the profile to the different apps that are installed.
Agreed, especially since as soon as you make a document, it seems to be out of date. Yeah, how do you keep it up to date?
Right. I mean, that's what I'm saying is like anything that you do in a static manner, it's bound to become sort of a hassle to maintain. So you really need some tooling around the current posture of your environment, right? So let's say you've approved a list of apps, right? You've gone through and you've approved them, but those with permissions who are able to, they can add new apps, right? So are you going to go and update Excel spreadsheet or Visio document to do this like every month or something? It's pretty hard to do. So you really need some automation around looking at Salesforce holistically and telling you that, hey, you've went through this process and you identified like this is the way your org should run from a security standpoint. Like these are the permission sets. This is how we're going to configure them. But now this is what has changed, right? So you need a process to almost like give you a security org assessment, right? Which is live and it doesn't go out of date. And it gives you all the moving pieces that, hey, here are all the remote sites that you've allowed, but somebody just added a new one, and it, do you know who did that and why did they do that? So all that stuff, I think if you can build automation on top of that to alert you on those things versus having to find out that you left your Salesforce on this corner and it has climbed up the stairs and gone somewhere else now. So our tool enables some of that automation, so it can sense changes and alert people that, hey, this has changed in your environment. Do you really approve this change or not? So it gives you a sort of a history of how things were and where they've gone. And I think that is where we would recommend people to go, instead of creating documentation that becomes hard to maintain. And I think that's the beauty of Salesforce, is that it is metadata driven, right? So you can build a lot of reporting on top of it using the metadata, right? And making sure that those changes are tracked within the environment. And then there's, of course, CI/CD tools, which enable you to document those changes, right? Application life management tools that you can employ as a process to make sure that no change goes into production. All changes happen in the sandbox or before that. So everything gets documented, and once in production, there are actually no surprises, right? For an admin that, hey, who did this, right? So it was interesting, meme going around about Salesforce environments back in the day and how they've progressed over time. And for some, I think, for not all, but there was like, who made this change? Why did they make this change? And then there was somebody, yelling that, does anybody know what's going on, right? So that is a worst case scenario for any admin or architect, right? Because they have no idea of who's making the changes, why they're making them, and what's the current posture of the environment. So that's that would be my recommendation, instead of managing static documents.
So I wrote 2 questions down in the chat so I didn't forget them. Speaking of CI/CD, how do you ensure if your CI/CD process is secure? So going beyond your org, that process to migrate things. And then I've got a follow-up question that's not related.
Sure. So, I mean, good security practices within the CI/CD pipeline is a must, right? We've seen, unfortunately, that has become an interesting attack vector with the SolarWinds hack, which basically altered code within a CI/CD pipeline, and that impacted thousands of customers across the board. So interestingly, with Salesforce, typically CI/CD pipelines used to be back in the back of an enterprise. Only developers had access to it, and it was kind of a black box. So once people shipped software out of that black box, they had some controls around making sure that software is secure. That's not to say that black box can't be compromised, but it was still a few layers of compromises you needed to get to that box. Now, especially with Salesforce, all the dev orgs, all the sandboxes, they're actually public, right? That's by design, because you're deploying to them, you're looking at changes from them. So for Salesforce, actually, CI/CD pipeline is actually more attractive from a hacker's perspective, right? Because that's where people think that, oh, it's only dev. I could have lax credentials. I don't need identity access management because it's just dev, it's test. oh, I don't need to create from, stricter controls around data access, because we're just using a subset of the data. So I think it is important to address security across the board. And with Salesforce, especially since it's all available on the internet, and it's available that it can compromise the security of your environment by being exploited in dev or sandbox. So I think it's really important to see those things in the CI/CD pipeline and secure the CI/CD pipeline.
Awesome. And then follow-up question, totally unrelated. What are some of the most impressive features in your mind, or some of the best features out there for security on the Salesforce platform?
So from a security perspective, I think the fact that the platform has really good auditing capabilities, right? The ability to look at changes and being able to trace those changes is actually a really good feature. The native features that enable like encryption and basically the ability to manage identities across different systems is also, a great feature, and if implemented correctly, can provide a lot of value. So those are some of the things that I find are really beneficial and great in Salesforce. The other thing is, since it's a sort of a holistic platform, it also gives you the opportunity to secure all the different elements in one place, because there's sometimes a disconnect between development and operations, but you can bring them together in Salesforce and really secure a system well, because all the different components are sort of in this one platform, and this unity brings this great opportunity of making, doing security right.
Nice. Awesome. Thank you. And I know we've got some questions in the chat. Paul, you want to start taking those in?
Yeah, I was just about to hop on that. So let's see. I'm unmuted. Mary asks, how does anonymizing the data in Sandbox help security?
It definitely helps the overall security posture, right? Because you don't have the connection with actual customers per se, right? It's still PII data. If it's PII data, even though if it's not connected to a customer's intent, a particular custom, it's still valuable. I think anonymizing it takes away the opportunity for a hacker to actually make it more valuable. It's still valuable, right? From a security perspective, if you compromise an anonymized data set, which can be sold on the dark web, it's still valuable, but it's not connected to someone, so its value is not as important. But let's say if you have anonymized credit card numbers, right? It's still pretty valuable, and it's something that can be used. So anonymizing is good because it takes away the connection of that data to an actual customer experience or something like that. But from a security perspective, you really want to protect that data, right? You don't want that data to leave your environment or be accessible to someone. So I think for those, if you have sensitive data, then I think proper controls around that should happen. For example, if it needs to be encrypted, it should be encrypted. If it is highly sensitive, it should not be accessible to everybody. And then I think it's always a good practice to have a test data set, which has the same same qualities, but not the same data, right? So if there are, you could use test credit cards for testing. You could use, test SSNs for testing SSN stuff. So things like that, I think, are a better approach to securing your data than just anonymizing it if it's sensitive data.
And then I hope you weren't expecting a structured pattern of questions. We're all over the place, hitting you from all sides. So thanks for fielding all these. Next question, what do you consider the most vulnerable surface in the Salesforce ecosystem that users are overlooking? Where are you coming up and setting, where do you most commonly see breaches that need to be mitigated?
Very good question. And I don't know if somebody's on this call who got an alert from Salesforce recently to secure their community site. But that's a very low-hanging fruit for hackers and malicious users or bug hunters, which is basically querying your Salesforce instance and say, hey, give me all the account objects. And if you have that enabled, Salesforce will happily give you all the account objects. If you have contracts, somebody queries, you have that enabled for guest users, Salesforce will happily give you because you've configured it that way. So I think that's a very easy exploit for anybody wanting to do harm. And this is why Salesforce sends out this alerts saying, hey, do you really want to expose these objects on the internet? And that's one area that we've seen, which is pretty common and is exploited quite often. The other interesting attack vectors from our perspective also is a lot of anonymous features like Web2 case, Web2 lead are in actually a very interesting attack vector, because you can have a Salesforce instance which is kind of in a controlled environment. Everybody has an identity. Maybe you don't have any guest users, maybe you don't have any external users, partner users, but you do allow some outside customers to interact with Salesforce by creating leads or cases and things like that. So you always have this anonymous user the ability to inject bad code or bad data within your environment, which could be code, right? So we have an interesting exploit that we drafted, which basically allows somebody to inject stuff from a contact us form, which creates a Web2 lead, and then we exploit a cross-site scripting issue, and then we escalate privileges. So that's an interesting thing that we've seen, which is based on code that we've actually observed in the ecosystem. So those are, I think, some of the low-hanging exploit vectors. If you look at it from an internal user standpoint, then there's many, right? People with access have many, URL hacking and just brute forcing IDs and getting data. All that stuff is fair game for an internal malicious user. So those are some of the things that I can share. There's many more.
And really
Great.
quick, as a side note, I know Salesforce keeps putting a lot of stuff out there to help prevent sharing with, crazy sharing and a lot of new guest rules, a lot of new preventions for putting and exposing too much data to community users. But people I've seen keep trying to get around that. And I know Nate called this out the other day on System.debug with, account name is not equal to blank as a sharing rule and things like that. These rules are going into place for a reason, to help you secure your data. Salesforce isn't doing them just because. So definitely, please try to pay attention to them. There's a reason behind them. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think with this new release of enforcing guest user policy, they've taken away edit and update on records created by guest users. I think that's a really good step in the right direction. But like you said, when you create a sharing rule for a guest user or an external user, and you create rules like nonsensical rules like that, that basically exposes all your data, all records, right? We've seen, for example, people create ridiculous rules like that, where name is only an integer type. Then don't share this rule. Names typically always contain alphabets, so all that data would get exposed. So I think these rules and ID equal null basically means that you want all of your data for that object to be accessible to all people in the world on the internet. And so although Salesforce is trying to do the best to give you the right tools, right? People can still make mistakes, or on purpose, just because it's hard to test, or it's a mess and you just want to give access to everything because that's the only solution that you can come up with. Actually, that has like serious security repercussions, because at that point, it's basically the same as giving like view all access to that profile. So thanks for mentioning that, Megan.
Sure. Jade had a question. Are there strategies to convince an organization's C-level execs who don't really believe in security to take it more seriously? Throwing out acronyms like PHI and HIPAA and GDPR. Any other strategies to encourage them to hire strategically?
So that's a great question. And I'll invite maybe Shannon to chime in. But from a security perspective, we've seen that on the C-level, Salesforce sometimes is operating in a very controlled environment. It's driven by sales, right? And primarily, right? And it is a customer relationship management system. So the driving force for changes in the environment are sometimes even overlooked by executives, right? Because they see that it's a SaaS platform, right? Salesforce takes care of all the security, and the reason we use it so that we don't have to worry about security, right? So for C-level organization, I think it's important to create an understanding that there are only few things that Salesforce is taking care of from a security standpoint, and there's a whole lot that you as a customer of Salesforce are responsible for, and it's set in kind of pretty good terms on Salesforce's side that security is a shared responsibility, which basically means that we will do our part, but you have to do your part. And if you don't do your part and you end up exposing your data, we're not really responsible or liable in any shape or form. And they give you the tools to make sure that you're secure. That's their responsibility. So I think that's the number one, I think, argument that you can present at the C-level to make sure that they take security seriously when they're operating in the Salesforce environment. But Shannon, feel free to share some of your insights.
I asked myself, Jade, great question. I ask myself this like every night before I go to bed and every morning when I wake up. So I'm actively striving for the perfect answer to this question. But yes, first of all, those acronyms, compliance motivates budget, and budget, after being in the pen testing world for 20 years, you like scrape and beg for a budget to do a $50,000 pen test sometimes at certain companies. But you want to do a compliance review, they'll chunk out 300, 400, 500,000 without thinking about it, because that's basically compliance allows them to do deals with big customers, right? Compliance, if you don't get it done, stops the revenue flow. It's one of the reasons Salesforce security has been an afterthought, because the main focus of Salesforce is accelerating the sales process, right? And making it more efficient to get all that customer data to all your salespeople out in the field and everyone else that's involved in that. And so there's this kind of fight between access and speed versus security and, safety, right? So compliance can help motivate that for sure, and that's a great one. And Salesforce, when it's not properly maintained, does violate compliance. The amazing thing about Salesforce, everyone's like, they start using it and it's super secure day one, and it has all these compliance logos all over it, and it's great. But as you modify it, those logos, those compliance frameworks, stretch out farther and harder to reach. And then of course your actual security posture and the chance of you losing your customer data increases over time. So yeah, I mean, anything you can do to wake executives up, at the end of the day, Salesforce pretty much contains the most valuable information in your company, which is all of your customer information, all of your deal flow, so if you're not getting proper support, I say you corner the CEO sometime at a random coffee or water stand once we get to see people again, and ask him, how secure he thinks the Salesforce, how secure is the Salesforce? I work on it every day, but we don't have a huge budget for security. Have we done an assessment, right? Do we have an idea? What's our posture? So ask those questions. People get thinking about it, then they start working together. There's only like one security person in a big company, sometimes two, right? And so it really, it's to all of us to be security people. And we got to pull on the execs for that support and that budget and that training and all that good stuff.
Yeah, Mary is bringing up a good point on the call, and I actually saw this. I heard about this through Grapevine, where somebody printed up a copy of the fines that another company had received based on not complying with certain orders. This was more around, I think, the unsubbing to email lists and stuff like that. Like, here's the standard set of government fines. You probably want to go ahead and find this in your budget right now if you choose to not follow these. So yeah, I think CCPA has a listing for punitive damages and so forth like that. So
it's funny you mentioned CCPA too, because the first company to be sued on January 2nd, 2020 by CCPA was Salesforce. So that was the very first violator of CCPA, a company which has a great record on security overall over the last 20 years. Hannah Anderson, who makes children's clothing, got their stuff hacked, and Salesforce and them were class actions lawsuit from customers and from the state of California, first day of January last year. But hey, so I gave you kind of the more diplomatic answer, right? How to motivate executives to focus on security and give you budget and training and all that good stuff. But you can also just throw this hearsay out there, which is, I've seen a lot of security audits in the last 10 years in the Salesforce arena. And I pretty much have never seen one that has, I mean, there's some rare cases, but pretty much all of them have high risk vulnerabilities, whether it's a dev situation or just an admin. Unless you're just using Salesforce out of the box, it's, Salesforce is so like amazing. Like, you can do anything with it. It's like the ultimate Play-Doh or 3D printer, right? You can just create, it's like Minecraft, right? But the more you create access to stuff, that's all attack surface, right? And the general production Salesforce org that we scan, has thousands of vulnerabilities in it. If it's been in use for over 5 years and people have been doing stuff to it besides just using it, it's most likely got hundreds, if not thousands, of vulnerabilities in there. So if you want to use a little FUD, I mean, that's pretty much, we're going to publish some stats later this year, but there's a lot of, all that access is also attack surface.
is there a 0-day listing for Salesforce, or is that something that I haven't even peeked into Salesforce's generic public security concerns?
That's a good question. One thing also I'll just throw out there is, Waqas has a demo hack we can show if anybody believes Salesforce is just absolutely secure and can never be cracked, where we leverage 2 vulnerabilities and go from contact us page to adminning your Salesforce in less than 5 minutes. So we can show that if we have time later today.
Yeah, no, that demo is amazing. I'm hoping we get time to show it.
So yeah, to your question, I think there's been like one large scale incident with Salesforce, right? There was a database script that exposed data for multiple customers, which was a faulty database script on Salesforce side. So there is not a whole lot of zero-day activity happening on the Salesforce side, but the technologies that Salesforce relies on, of course, has many bugs that get, that are impacted to Salesforce, but that's, not in the purview of public knowledge, because it's a closed system from a user's perspective. So I don't think there is outside of that database script any known like 0 days for Salesforce.
Now, if your security admin refers to it as an O day, do you fire them or do you just lay them off?
And you don't lay any security people off. They're so hard to find. You educate them and, try to ask why they're mistaken. That's been my first recommendation.
Yeah, that was my least favorite conversation with the security professionals. And I was hoping and glad to hear you guys say it as 0 day. It's one thing you type everywhere, but like O day? What's an O day attack? What are you talking about? Oh, you mean 0 day. And you're okay. But yeah, red flag.
And typically 0 days has been like, it's been many days and many people have already been exploited by it. So it's technically not even 0 day. So,
yeah, fun stuff. Are there any useful blog sites or places that you go where people are doing research on Salesforce security and posting news? Where can we go subscribe? What feeds can we monitor? And again, if this is I'm not intentionally softballing you all of these questions for you to advertise. These are legitimate. Where should people go and read to make sure they're up on the latest security goings on with Salesforce?
yeah, I think a great resource is the Salesforce Security Hub. I think it's called a Cybersecurity Hub, which allows the different personas be able to understand cybersecurity from a Salesforce perspective. It also talks about a lot of compliance related initiatives within Salesforce. Another great resource is the developer guide, the Secure Developer Guide, which is on, I believe, the trust.salesforce.com site, which basically trains developers on what are the security implications of code in Salesforce. So writing Apex, Lightning Web Components, and Visual Force pages, things like that. Those are, I think, some of the good resources that you can rely on. Also, Salesforce Ben has some great articles as well.
Oh, okay. That's a good question. Megan, you want to ask or you want me to ask?
Go for it. I'm grabbing the other questions we missed from above.
Okay. So from CTA's perspective, at what particular point do we need to maintain a checklist guide of best security measures taken within an org? There are various SMEs that have Salesforce implemented, and most of them are sort of quick start projects. But if we focus too much on security, the cost of the implementation goes up. So is there any guide or formula to consider to spend time or effort solely on security implementation? I think that's basically asking what's the ratio of project hours to security dev that you think we should see or invest in on new implementations?
Yeah. And I think it's a great question, because the whole point of having a platform like Salesforce is, starting easily. There's a low barrier to entry, and then customizing it as you need. But I think from a security perspective, not having any idea of how you're going to manage personas and permission sets and things like that out of the bat, and then thinking, oh, we'll figure this out 6 months down the road, will be very problematic. So having at least some semblance of how you're going to manage data access and identity on the get-go, I think is a recommended best practice. And then also create a process on how you will change these things, right? And how you will manage like the security of adding new code or enabling new features, or when we're creating flows, we must always have permissions inherited and not have everything run as system, and things like that. So those best practices, I think, should be documented sort of in the get-go, so that you start right. And then I think as things change, as you add new features, then you can start documenting that, yeah, we've added this new way of connecting this external system. How do we secure it? So I think from a security perspective, whenever a project gets started, I think having a discussion on what is our critical use case, how do we protect against someone malicious, right? Sort of creating this threat model in your mind, right? What are the main threats to the data in this environment? And you update that as you go, as you add more features, as you add more, do more implementations and projects to it. Having security as a critical part of it will make you sort of updated. And a good process to manage that is published, for example, the Microsoft SDL process that talks about all these key elements as you're doing a project, and it's designed to be agile. So it's not like, it is very cumbersome. So when you start small, have small best practices with that in mind, and then as you grow, you can change and adopt to the needs of the security. So I would definitely recommend looking up the SDL process from Microsoft to use as a standard best practice.
And really quick to emphasize, document those processes, get them down on paper from the beginning. Like, get a digital copy of what that process is going to be and make sure everyone understands it. The worst thing that you can do for yourself and your team is to be continuously changing the process week after week and have nobody know what their actual process is. And to say you have a process, but to have no rhyme or reason, and to be changing it time after time so that nobody knows what they're actually doing, and then to have actual security mishaps easily sneak through. Sorry.
Very good point. Well, thank you for making that point. Yeah, document your data model, document everything that you're supposed to be doing when you're managing data access and identity, so that you don't have issues down the road where you cannot change things because you started on the wrong foot.
And then one of the next questions was about best practices for any recommendations and best practices with using Salesforce big objects. And then what about external objects?
Yeah, so it's basically the same recommendations, right, for a data model. External objects basically get data from an external source. Data access should be modeled the same way as you're doing it for custom objects, because they're in essence an extension of custom objects. And the same level of security needs to be implemented for them. So having the standards model will help address the needs for these custom objects.
And to add fun facts in about external objects. So with your external objects, you have two ways to access them. You can go by user and get individual permissions set on the other side, or you can have an integration user and then you get access to the objects, no matter, as long as you have access to the objects and there is no, per record access. If you need actual per record security, don't get the integration user and try to come up with something crazy, sneaky in Salesforce. It's a huge pain and it's not super secure. So think about what you actually need and what your long-term goals are, and if that data is going to need to be for an individual user as a side point.
Yeah, I think identity, if the identity is going to be managed by the integration, then you need access control on the external side. But yeah, if it's the user, then you implement the user security. Yep, that's a good point.
Question up at the top, I put about App Exchange. You know, there's this thought, if you think of like our phones, like, oh, there's these app stores and they do their security review. So I'm good, I just can install it. But then as we know, a lot of apps hopefully give you like the ability to decide, can it access your camera, your photos and things like that. So similarly in the Salesforce platform, I'm just curious. It's another area where I think what you've been talking about today applies, where you have to do, you know, your own considerations of what that app can do and should it be allowed to do certain things in the org. Just wondering if you had any sort of recommendations to assess the security of an app and not just assume, well, because it's from the App Store and it goes through a security review, then that's all as an admin or architect or developer that we have to do.
Oh, that's a very good question, and I think it's an interesting challenge, right? Because App Exchange does have a security review process, right? And they review every application that they allow to be in the App Exchange. And I think from somebody who's implementing the solution, it's closed source, so you don't have access to the backend source. You only have access to the static components or the front end of the application, right? So it's basically very limited for somebody to consume and actually assess the security of that app. From somebody who's consuming the app, I think there's some best practices that can be implemented to make sure that you're not exposing yourself. For example, some apps are designed to be used externally, right? Like on community or experience sites. I think those are very high risk apps. So making sure that you have the right backend to support those apps, and you don't have a situation where you are opening up more access than you should for that app. That's one. The second is making sure those apps are up to date, right? We've unfortunately seen that many of these apps go stale. They use a lot of third-party components, and they have, they can potentially have issues. So those are some of the things that, as an admin, you can look at from apps coming from App Exchange. The other thing is that if the app is requiring you to integrate into a third party, how comfortable you as a company are to integrate with that third party. So assessing the third party security is actually an interesting aspect of using an app. So you may be using an app vendor, but the app vendor may be sending your data to 3 or 4 other integrations, right? So understanding all that is actually really important when you're using an app from App Exchange. Just thinking that it's coming from App Exchange and there's no security implications would not be the best approach. And off and on, we do see issues with apps, and that's natural, right? Even with your apps on Android or iOS, there are security bugs with them, right? And sometimes they're very serious. They expose a lot of data for other customers. So that happens with App Exchange as well. That's just the nature of the beast. But I think for the most part, there's not a whole lot other than the trust that Salesforce has built with the security review process, that these applications have been vetted and they're secure and safe to use.
And one other thing, so to really quick talk about your product for a second. So I did run a Digitsec review on an org, And I gotta say, there were a number of apps that ended up coming up with issues, be it high or medium. And some of them had been through App Exchange review, some of them hadn't. And those unofficial SF components had quite a number. And keep in mind, they're just available out there on GitHub and via the unofficial SF site. And they're great and they're handy, but they have some issues with security. So just something I never really thought about, and I didn't, go, hey, Salesforce made these, although they're not Salesforce, they're by people at Salesforce. It wasn't something that I thought about as much, that they would be such a giant red flag. And I didn't realize how much my devs were doing to update them. And every time we put them into the repo and made them reusable. So if you're using those, make sure that you've got somebody that does a review and does the tweaks to them and updates their security. And also make sure that you're checking out the security of anything that you install, be it managed, unmanaged, open source, and that you still take the time to review those items, especially unmanaged, where you can go in and check out the code and check for any loophole.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you are able to do a deep dive and get some assurance on it, that's the best thing. But like you said, Megan, just because you've installed an app a point in time, it doesn't mean that it's going to stay secure for forever. Like there's always new exploits. There's new exploits coming out. There's a lot of third-party components which are used. There's a lot of open source things which are used, and that's actually a pretty interesting attack vector too, right? So if you compromise an application which is used by a few thousand customers, from a hacker's perspective, it's just much more valuable than me just exploiting like one Salesforce customer, right? So if I find a flaw in one of these apps, then I can replicate that attack across many people who are using that app. So it is actually very important to make sure you're assessing the security of those.
And speaking of the hacker side, I mentioned before, I kind of wanted to go back to the idea of looking at Salesforce from a hacker's point of view. You mentioned that in the beginning. I'd love to hear more about what are some of those ways that we can look at Salesforce from a hacker's point of view as we're building, seeing as most of us are builders, not hackers. How do we make sure we're looking at things in that point of view and making sure we're compensating for what a hacker would do and getting into that mindset?
Yeah, I think there are a few dilemmas, right, for builders versus attackers, right? Or you can say hackers, whatever term you want to use. And there are some advantages that the hackers have and some advantages that the builders have, right? I can enumerate from an attacker's perspective. So the attacker basically has to exploit one issue, right? So the weakest link, that's the target. It could be something more complicated or sophisticated, but they basically need one thing to exploit and get in. From a builder perspective, they have to protect all of their entry points, right? So for a builder, the challenge is making sure that all of the attack vectors are closed off. From an attacker, all the attacker has to do is find one. The other is that for a builder, the attack can be something that right? If you know that somebody can attack you using a certain way, you can protect against that, right? For an attacker, there's always ways of finding new things to do, right? So there's an advantage for an attacker standpoint. Now, the advantage for a builder, which the attacker doesn't have, is control, right? So the attacker is looking for control, whether that's the weakest point or a new exploit. But a builder has the ability and the visibility in the system. So if you want to protect yourself, you have to look at like everything that you're building, how somebody would use the same feature maliciously. One way of doing it is like consider everything that comes from a user be malicious, right? If you're getting an ID, or if you're getting a string type, or if you're thinking that a user should only be able to select from a pick list, what if they pick something which is not available in the pick list? What would happen in the code then? So assume like every single input into the system is malicious, right? And how do you protect against it? And then, building a system around that, so you have the advantage that the attacker is not able to easily identify these things. But from I can go on like, hackers, like malicious hackers don't play by the rules. We as builders and security people play by the rules. So they, they have a lot of advantages to, from an attack perspective. But the one key advantage as builders that we have is the ability to look at the system from the inside and then make sure we secure, we have the visibility to secure all the attack vectors. But it's a process, right? The other thing is like, there's no such thing as, a completely 100% secure system or environment, because the world is changing, the technology is changing, the systems themselves are changing. So security needs to be an ongoing process. It needs to be a state of mind, right? Somebody on the team, or ideally everybody on the team, has the ability to look at the changes that they're making in the Salesforce environment from a security perspective, right? Because it is very hard to scale security people with developers. There's more developers. The ratio is, I think, 500 to 1. So there's, one security professional to every 500 developers. So there's no way that you could have a good ratio. But enabling the developers so they can build securely from the ground up is something that is a very good practice. And security, like I said, is a process. It's not a panacea.
And question, just as a side joke, is it kind of like they fly through the Da Vinci Code as a Salesforce hacker, just like when everyone else is hacking the planet? Or is it a little bit different? Hackers reference. So sorry if anyone else has seen that movie.
Oh, the Da Vinci, you said Da Vinci Code.
Da Vinci, the Da Vinci pictures. Sorry.
Yeah, the Da Vinci virus, yeah.
Yeah, the Da Vinci virus.
It nibbles.
Why does he pick flea as his name of all things, man? Like, come on.
We're gonna hack Gibson.
So
Hey, Shannon had a comment.
Yes, he did.
He was trying to sneak in. Yeah.
So yeah, your Mac crashes like twice a year, right? When you actually want to say something. I had to hard crash, but yeah, I thought the App Exchange question was really interesting. First of all, that's kind of what brought Waqas and I to this ecosystem together, doing pen tests for App Exchange, people that failed the App Exchange review. So we've been dealing with this for like almost 10 years now, but we've been doing some research over the last couple of years, Waqas and his team, and we're doing another run right now. We don't have the exact stats, but I would comfortably say that the majority of the apps in the App Exchange have vulnerabilities in them through third-party software libraries. Obviously they passed a code test, so their code's good, which is great. But almost all the apps in the App Exchange use third-party software libraries like jQuery and all kinds of normal libraries that people use in app development. And the problem is those apps, those libraries become insecure, like out on the net, publicly posted CVEs, globally known. But even if a company is really on top of their game and they're like, ooh, our app and that library just went insecure, the basic but it takes them a while to update the app and get it back into the App Exchange, re-reviewed and reposted. So that process can sometimes take months, right? And as a result, the majority of the apps in the App Exchange have vulnerabilities. And when you install them in your org, you inherit those vulnerabilities. So you can find those by using a SCA or software composition analysis scanner. But yeah, apps, I've talked to people all the time. They're like, oh, I don't do any development in my org, so I'm totally secure. I'm like, well, do you use apps? They're like, oh yeah, we have 7 apps. I was like, all right, well, you're not secure then. I've seen one app with one bad library introduce 1,500 high risks in an org. So you gotta be cognizant of your apps. Use good apps. Don't use apps that haven't been updated for years, and think you're safe.
Nice. Agreed. And again, just be careful about those App Exchange listings you find via Google instead of via the App Exchange. That's one way to tell what has gone through security review as a tip. Items that are found via the App Exchange search bar at the top, those ones have gone through the security review. If you find it via Google, most of them that have the little orange bar across the top have not gone through security review. And that's a way to tell the difference between the two. But you can still get on the App Exchange without going through security review. It's just that you're not in the same search. You find them differently.
Yeah, that's a whole nother category. Those apps, yeah, no guarantee on those apps. But even the good apps that you all know and love, like from the billion-dollar companies that we all trust, they know when their app becomes insecure due to a library. But it still takes them weeks or months to get that updated, sometimes longer. So yeah, it's a mixed bag, but the majority of the apps out there have some sort of, it's the same thing with phones. It takes a lot of time to update phones, and like everyone buys a new phone every year. So the whole idea of mobile security is really an oxymoron, because the update cycles for phones is so long that by the time a reported bug gets fixed and gets through all the carriers and all the devices, everyone's buying new phones. So the majority of the time you have your phone, it's insecure.
Nice. And then I like your comment, Daniel, that apps are native also aren't 100% assumed to be without vulnerabilities. So true. So true. We've gotten questions to slow down a bit. I think it would be great to check out that demo. What are you guys thinking?
Yeah, Waqas, do you want to, if I bring it up, will you take us through?
Sure, absolutely. Let's do it.
All right, can I share my screen here? There we go. All right. Let me stop my video. And then, yeah, I'll let you introduce it and then tell me when to hit play.
Sure. So I touched upon this as we were starting about this exploit that we show. It exploits a common feature which is called web to lead. You must be very familiar with it, so I'm not going to go into explaining what that is. But this is exploiting 2 issues with Salesforce. And the first exploit deals with input validation and the way data is rendered within Visualforce pages. And the second one deals with the way code is run on the Salesforce backend. So go ahead, Shannon, if you can play, I can go over the exploit. So you have a basic contact us form on the website where instead of sending good data, we're sending an exploit, which when loads on the Salesforce side, we're able to grab a user's session remotely. And once we do that, we can use this user's session to then query Salesforce for data. And then you can do this via the Salesforce API if it's enabled, or do it in the browser, whichever way you like it. We're just going to use the API because you can just write SOQL statements in the API. So the first one is just like, select accounts. And we see that this user has, access to some accounts, although this is all test data. So there is no actual data that's being used in this exploit. Then we look up like who the user is that we've just compromised. An easy way to do that is just query the Chatter API. And we get the user's email and some information about the user. You can also look at their photo if they have one set up. But given that we know it's an internal user, it's has some access to some data, the next step for us is to identify like how much data we can get to. One way of doing that is basically querying Salesforce for all different Apex controllers, Visualforce pages, things like that, which have been deployed within the org. That's where you can find a lot of exploits. So we query the Salesforce API to get a list of all the available Visualforce pages. An easy way to tell that this user has the correct permissions to invoke this page is to just do a GET request. And if Salesforce responds with a error or a 500 or 403, then we know that this particular page is not accessible. But if you get a 200 back, that means that the page is accessible. So the first request was not, we got an error. For the second one, we will get a response from the Salesforce API saying that, you know, this page is accessible. So now we'll take the session ID that we had compromised. After going through this exercise, we can identify like what's available, what's not. We will basically plug this value into a browser and load the user that we've just compromised. And so this is the user we had compromised. It's a standard platform user profile. The user has access, but it's not all the access. So we come across this page, which allows the user to change their profiles. It doesn't, you know, it has some preset values in that pick list. So what we will do is we'll select a value from the pick list, let's say as a partner user, to switch the profile to, and the request will go through a proxy, and then we will change the parameters in the request. So basically what we're trying to identify is if the actual code on the back end is doing any validation of these pick list values, or if it's like making sure that the user doesn't escalate privileges. And we'll change the, you know, the selected value from the pick list from a system, from a partner user to a system administrator. And then we'll send this request off to Salesforce, to the Salesforce deployment. So we've got the request, we'll plug it into the payload that we had stopped in the proxy, and then we'll send it off to Salesforce, and then we'll look at the response that comes back from that controller. And we see that it was a success. So the request was processed. Now we have to go and basically refresh the page to actually make sure that it actually changed the profile or not.
Waqas, can I pause you for a second and narrate and maybe catch people up? So or if you're running a video, then I can save my question for the end.
No, sure, go ahead.
The video's done now. He basically got system admin. He owned the org with those two at.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah, it popped in right at the. So go ahead and finish up. So just talking through the tools that you were using and how this was going about, I think you used a kind of a wire sniffer to grab a session client from an active user or any active user, and then you used a couple other tools that were just looking for pages that were allowed to be accessed. Sorry, I'm just trying to put in a little plain user terms the anatomy of the attack.
Yeah, so the first exploit basically is a cross-site scripting exploit, which basically injects malicious JavaScript into a Visualforce page that's rendering a lead. And once that happens, on that page, the user's session ID is available as part of that page. And then we we grab that. So the JavaScript is designed to send that and send it to a server of the attacker. So once that happens, we went to this screen, which is basically a server listening, right, for that exploit to work. And once it works, it basically gives you that session ID of that user. And once we're able to get that, then we go down using like basic curl commands, which is to request stuff from the Salesforce API, where you can just like construct SOQL statements and get data in JSON format. And once we did that exercise, then we went into the browser and we used the browser and a web proxy, which basically allows you to meddle with requests before they're sent to a server. So the proxy lives between a user's browser and the Salesforce server. So you're able to manipulate like, parameters. If the UI doesn't allow you to change something, you can change it in the proxy. So you can change like all sort of parameters and find all kinds of bugs through that. So those are the key tools used in the overall.
Yeah, curl is a
process.
very common command line based like web request tool. We use that for REST debugging. So for anybody that this looks like hardcore hacking, these are really fairly basic tools, crafting custom URLs to get information that we don't see in the browser, but is very, very much there and exposed in the interaction behind the scenes.
Exactly. This is all open stuff. I mean, this is a canned hack. And obviously, if a real hacker was attacking this org and this website, it would take them more than 5 minutes to figure this out because they didn't just construct the maze like Waqas did. But it's a real website. It's a real Salesforce instance. These are two real vulnerabilities that we see all the time. And it's, a real hacker might take, whatever, hours, maybe a day or two to figure this out, probably hours if they're a good hacker. And these, but this is definitely a very realistic scenario. And it's not super sophisticated from a hacker point of view.
The cross-site scripting component. Oh, I'm sorry, Megan.
Oh, sorry. Waqas, I'm going to ask you the same question I asked you when I saw this demo the first time. So this is web to lead. If you're using like an out-of-the-box lightning action, do you have the same type of vulnerabilities?
So it really depends on the controller that is calling.
No controller. We're talking out-of-the-box declarative action.
Yeah, then there's no issues because
Yeah,
the object permissions get enforced. But if you have what is it called, the Lightning Web Component action, which you can have a controller,
right.
then you can have a similar scenario.
So for when the rest of you are building, keep in mind, try to stick with that out of the box if you can. Just another advantage right here.
Exactly.
Yeah. Salesforce out of the box is, I mean, they do their security hardcore internally.
Yeah, and I mean, these things are available, and if done right, they can be very secure. But out of the box features, of course, have built-in security, so you can have a better bang for your buck. But the fact that not every use case is satisfied by out-of-the-box functionality is where a lot of the security bugs come up as well.
So can I ask, the cross-site scripting attack that launched this whole thing, how hard is that to implement, or how worried should we be that that's possibly going on? To me, that, and I hate the cross-site scripting protections because I'm a heavy JavaScript iframer and love to be able to pull resources in. So I am annoyed constantly by XSS security preventions. So knowing that all is out there now, what does it take to get a cross-site scripting attack onto a web page, or what's that initial foot in the door?
And really quick, to add to your question, what about the options to do that for all from this domain versus all from this domain plus subdomains versus this domain plus all the sites that I add for cross-site scripting setting? We're doing a lot of work in communities. I know we've got that the cross-site script saying protection sites and that where we can add to the list, and we can have just those sites we add to the list added. Want to add that into the question as, for that side of the danger too, and where does that fall in the security risk area?
Yeah, so the cross-site scripting protections that are part of the platform basically protect you against an actual exploit. So it doesn't directly take away like all cross-site scripting. It protects you from like somebody being able to execute JavaScript, for example, right? So the first step that we did was executing JavaScript, right? So if you take that ability away, it's not that somebody cannot exploit you. It's like they won't be able to execute JavaScript. They can still build HTML elements, right? And then have the user interact with those elements, right? So they're still able to inject things, but you're gaining protection from like JavaScript execution. So those controls basically make it hard for somebody to exploit cross-site scripting. It doesn't take away the fact that you have like a cross-site scripting vulnerability within an app. So I think from a user's perspective, you must, it's ideal to fix those bugs instead of relying on taking one ability away from an attacker to think that, we're protected. But those settings are actually very, very effective in stopping some attacks, some common attacks. So I think as an admin, it's important to enable those because they protect your user sessions. The other thing interesting with cross-site scripting is that when something happens on a site that your customer owns or you own, there's a trust associated with it, right? So for example, if I am on Amazon's site, I trust Amazon. So all the web components or the web elements they're presenting with me, I trust them, right? So there's a trust associated with the data that's coming from Amazon. So the most attacks exploit that trust, right? So even if they're not able to execute JavaScript, or even if they're not able to directly compromise a session, they would exploit the trust that a user has. And that may be just like redirecting them to a malicious site or redirecting them to, or making them download something that they shouldn't be able to download. So the exploit, while there's an element of it is to compromise user sessions, but if you even have that covered and there's little that can be done to compromise a user session, the trust can still be exploited, right? Even if you're able to just put a statement there that this thing is on sale or something, like there could be financial implications, or where we regret to say something has happened, right? Similar scenario with like famous people's Twitter getting hacked, right? The content itself has a lot of value, so even if somebody can hijack that content, you still want to be careful with that attack vector. So it's always best to fix the bug than rely on protections which come with the platform, which are great and I think should be enabled. But it's kind of like whack-a-mole, right? That we'll do this, and if this protects us, that's fine. But if a new exploit comes up, then we'll try to mitigate this. But if you fix the issue at the root, then nobody will be able to exploit cross-site scripting in your environment.
So, and from a little bit of a newbie perspective, isn't creating a cross-site scripting attack have to do with being able to have a pull of malicious code from within the web page? Don't you have to have compromised through a banner ad or something to get your code, the malicious code, onto that page, or call malicious code that's not necessarily stored on that original domain from some other domain? So you're taking the original way that cross-site scripting happened, I believe, was banner providers would be compromised, and then whenever a website pulled in that banner or ad banner content, there would be additional content, and that was what would compromise the user. and do things within the browser and within the session. So isn't that first hack getting foreign code embedded into the website somehow?
Yeah, so in Salesforce terms, it's basically writing to an object, right, with that malicious data, which is in the lead object field. And then when that data gets rendered within Salesforce is where the vulnerability happens. And that's happening on a Visualforce page, which doesn't encode that input properly. And that's where it gets rendered and executed. So
okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah.
I have a question that will cost on the cross-site scripting injection bug, if you will, or vulnerability. How would people detect that? Is it, I mean, can you get that from a source code analysis, or is a config check, health check going to get that, or do you really need to do a runtime test to find that bug?
So you can find that bug both by doing some static code analysis and also by doing a runtime testing, right? Runtime is basically executing the way that we executed this exploit, right? Looking at all the inputs to a given Salesforce environment and sending, crafted payloads, and then seeing the response and rendering that within that given Visualforce page or component, and then seeing if our input was executed. So that's actually the one of the most effective ways of finding this bug is to actually simulating the same thing that we did with this attack, and that's how somebody would go in and identify a cross-site scripting bug. The other way is looking at the code and making sure that all the input that is coming from the user side, which is user-controlled input, is properly rendered within the different HTML elements in Salesforce. And Salesforce provides native encoding capabilities to protect against those. So making sure that you call those when you're rendering that data will protect you against things like that.
Nice. And I know we're we've been chatting for a while. I just kind of want to open it up to everybody. If you guys have questions, take yourselves off of mute. Opening up the floor. You guys don't have to use the chat to ask questions. What else you guys got? So quiet.
I don't have a question, but I guess I have a comment. Shannon and I met with a CISO last week for coffee, and she's on the board of this company in Chicago, and the CEO asked her, hey, was asking her about security and what he can do to in his company. And she said the first thing is, like, security is a team sport. She said, it's not just for the CISO, one person. She's like, every person you hire, empower them to be involved in the security process. And I thought that was a really powerful thing, that it wasn't just, it doesn't just fall on one person. It's really, she said, it's the responsibility of everyone in the company, and she encouraged everyone to be proactive in it. So I thought that was good advice.
I like that security is a team sport. That's a great way to put it. And just another thing about security, it's okay to not know what you don't know and to admit it. I have to say, probably one of the worst things to do when it comes to security is to say, well, I don't know how to do it, so I'll just open it up and then hide it. Probably the scariest org I ever walked into was a community. So we're already walking into the exposing our data to the outside world. And that community, they weren't sure how to work to share it, and they couldn't get it to work the way they wanted. So they gave everybody view all and modify all, then decided to hide the data with components. And they were using components for a lot of it, but they were still using the out of the box search And you can still hack a URL in a community just like you can in Salesforce by dropping an ID at the end or switching the last character up. So people had view all and modify all, and if they could figure out what the URL was to the standard page, they could then go in and modify anything they wanted because nobody decided to then go through it and at least make all the fields read only. So it was probably one of the most terrifying things I had ever seen in my life was, you know, rather than say, this isn't what I know how to do, somebody deciding to wing it by opening everything up and then going a heavy dev route, but still sticking with a bunch of out of the box stuff. Terrifying. I don't know if anybody else has seen some security horror stories, but you know, it's
So,
true what they say about making a career out of cleanup work for security.
yeah, it's just the state of security I've seen in general for the last 20 years, like professionally. I've almost, it's like over 90% of the time, a security pen test results in total compromise, whether it's a network or an application, you know, and I thought, you know, Salesforce would be different, but Salesforce has been no different. You know, the general state of security across the world is not as good as it needs to be. And really it's because we've relied on these senior IT people and security people to take care of it for us. And it's back to what Ryan said, which is at the end of the day, we're all responsible for our own security and our own safety. And, you know, we all have to take some level of responsibility and knowledge, and learning just a little goes a very long way. So, you know, it's amazing. Like if a good hacker comes at you, the majority of the time, they're going to have full access to everything. But, you know, little steps that everyone can take can make a big difference. It's like that quote from Gandalf, where it's the little people that make the big differences, you know, and I really think that's true.
And I am going to say one of my favorite quotes when it comes to Salesforce and the superpowers that they give us. And I'll just share it here on my screen. With great power comes great responsibility. Salesforce gives us so many options and so much power with the platform. But with that power, we have to be careful. And you know, just because they give us the ability to do so much more and open things up with security, it's for the instances in which we have to. It's not for making it super, super open all the time. And, you know, like Waqas said, keep things, you know, permissions to a minimum. And, you know, one of my favorite things to do is make sure to have people that are in a QA that know security and know how to test for security, or at least help them get some security scripts together. So they know how to do some negative tests and positive tests against security. And then also making sure that, you know, your devs are following sharing, and they're only, you know, not sharing when they absolutely have to. Not following sharing when they absolutely have to. Some of those basic items. But yeah.
So I would probably, Megan, to add on to that, promote that with the growth of the ecosystem and the influx and massive growth of development resources, that the maturity path for a developer should be up to architect and then to security architect, because people are entering the coding work ecosystem and coding production code before they understand the security layers that they're passing and working with. You know, this stuff, I've been doing this since, you know, internet was command line and you could only see stuff on BBS. So I see where it's grown up and I can see the layer changes, and some of the stuff, you know, a lot, but not all of what Waqas did during the hack makes sense to me. And I've been doing this for 40 years. People that are getting into it in 2 or 3 years are not going to have this perspective. And that's, you know, what architects do is try and build workable solutions and tell, you know, more junior people how to assemble good, high functioning solutions. And then as architects, we should be maturing up to know when, where, and how to secure them, because we're aware of the depth of penetration of all the things we're assembling happens at the security layer. And that's an aspect of architecture, but maybe the, kind of the pinnacle of architecture. And we need to continue to pitch that a key component of architecture and Salesforce solution and TechArc is security architecture, because people aren't doing it and they just don't have the experience to know that all of this stuff is going on. And it's a side effect of the growth and being in a great ecosystem that's evolving so fast as we're creating attack surfaces faster than we can understand them or learn that they're there.
All right, I'm gonna, so I don't know if you meant to say that a path for a developer should be to go to architect and then security architect, but I mean, if you did, I don't know if I agree with that. I mean,
well, it doesn't have to be everybody's path, but you really,
yeah,
you
I
have
see them
to.
as totally different career paths.
Yeah.
Like developer is a developer path, architect is an architect path. Yeah.
Does anyone notice that basically we're getting a lot of really new people in the system, and they
We
want to
are.
be developers because developing pays a lot more than, and they don't necessarily understand what it takes to be a good admin?
Yes, and I would say that knowing administrative skills. So I could have sworn that back in the day you had to get admin to get the old developer cert before it was PD1, the Dev 400 or the Dev 405. But now it seems like PD1, there's no requirement to get the admin cert first. I think it's vital to understand the platform as an admin before becoming a developer. Not you have to be an admin, but to at least understand the declarative side and the basic, what is security for, declarative, what is the basic platform, what is out there that we could do with clicks before code, and just choosing to become a developer because that's where there's a need or that's where money's at. And so many new devs that are out there that just don't know Salesforce. I'm not saying that not all new devs know Salesforce. There's just a bunch of them that don't, and it just leads to either having to write super detailed tickets, or a lot of turnover sometimes. I would say every time, but sometimes, yeah.
Well,
and
it's
a pain.
So with these 5th and 9th and 10th generation languages, you're coding so far from where the actual application happens. People don't, the code abstracts it. We go in and create an object in a web interface, and that sets up or enables a REST endpoint to talk to that object. Most admins aren't going to know that. There's no class really that tells you, hey, by the way, you're opening this up for public consumption for anybody to come in and poke at if they've got a credential, and they can do it with API access if you haven't secured that. But even understanding all of the implications of the stuff you do is a rare talent, and they're trying to make this stuff easier with flows. You don't have to do memory management anymore. You used to have to maintain the size and allocation of variables as you were going through loops. They took that work out of it.
Remember that count that you used to have to do.
Yeah, with malloc and garbage collection and stuff like that. So by taking these away, you remove the opportunity to learn how the system is actually working behind the scenes, and so that knowledge just isn't fostered anymore.
Yep. Yeah. No, I just want to add.
Everyone fully needs that, though. As long as you know what you need to do, I don't think you fully need to understand the back end.
Well, yeah.
As long as you know the steps that you need to.
You've made a really good point, Megan. I mean, you don't have to be an admin for 5 years before you can develop or whatever, but you need to understand what's going on the operations side. I mean, the whole idea of DevOps and DevSecOps, it's the final realization that we've been in this web world for over 10 years now, and people are developing stuff that immediately gets put on the network, right, into operation. And this whole idea that you can just be a developer or you can just be an admin, and no one needs to worry about security. it's just not realistic for all the reasons that Paul just mentioned. This used to be different, right? People would develop stuff and then it would get tested and then it would get security tested and then it would get put out on a network. And, the network people were in charge of the security of the application running on the network. But now stuff gets produced and like a day later, it's being popped up into Salesforce or on the web and, it's live, right? And so this whole idea of like, we'll test security once a year and it'll be fine isn't realistic. I mean, new security vulnerabilities, even external, like third-party libraries become, exposed every day, whether you've made any changes or not, right? So this is like a continuous process. We're all involved in on the planet as a team together here, whether we like it or not. And, code is not separate from admin. They're all one and the same now. And you have to have at least an understanding of how these things are being deployed if you're going to develop for them.
Yeah. And we do have another question about what are some of the best ways to use the security center. So, Waqas, I don't know if you have any recommendations about the security center. I know that it's great to do a scan, but it's also pretty high level. Other feedback. I think Waqas might have stepped away. He's going to a picture. And he's on mute.
Sorry, I don't.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah, what's the question again? I'm sorry.
Any tips on using the security center or recommendations to get the most value out of it? No, the security scan.
Are you talking about the force.com scanner?
So let me scroll back up on the question. Sorry, it just went down. The SF Security Center.
Okay, this is basically kind of like what we were talking about earlier, around, who can see what type of data. Also, it has the ability to look at like authentication patterns and stuff like that. So I think it's definitely a good tool to utilize and detect some anomalies and things like that. But that's around like identity management and access control. For that scenario, I think it's very helpful.
Does that answer your question? Come on. Hopefully.
Yeah, that
There you are.
does. Sorry, I was in a
Okay.
in a noisy area, so I was kind of on mute all the time. Sorry.
No worries. All right. So I know we are at just after 11. This has been a great session, everybody. Again, thank you so much for Waqas for all of your feedback and all of your info. I think we all got a lot out of it today.
Thank you.
One last
Hopefully-
opportunity for
yeah,
questions,
hopefully-
people. Sorry, Waqas, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Megan.
Oh, I was just saying one last opportunity for questions, everyone, before we're gonna wrap up. Okay.
Great job, everyone. Megan, Paul, the whole team, Daniel, we appreciate you guys doing this, and it was a blast.
Thank you.
Yeah,
that was
thank you
great
all for
information.
coming.
Thank you.
Please be
This
well,
was
everyone.
fantastic.
Yeah, well, if anybody ever wants to run a free security assessment, they can. Waqas has it ready on Digitsec for you, so give it a free trial there.
Awesome. And then Waqas, Shannon, Ryan, do you guys want to stay on the line? Same with Daniel and Paul.
Sure, we're happy to.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, everybody. You have a good one.